Okay. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us and registering for this webinar today in partnership with Page. This webinar, we will showcase the winners of the 2026 IPR Page Case Study Competition, and they're going to discuss their award-winning case study, Veritas versus Trump, tracing the tensions between institutional autonomy and federal authority. Our panelists here today, we have Veritas Sandoval, Aaron Taylor, and Benjamin Schwartzman from the University of Oregon. We have their faculty advisor, Dr. Donna Davis, endowed chair in PR, and then director of their Immersive Media and Strategic Communications Master's Program. And then our moderator today is Ethan McCarty, founder and CEO of Integral. And so thank you all for being here. We're going to go over the case study and then do a moderated Q&A and then transition into an audience Q&A. So at that time, we'd love to have you all submit questions in the chat, and then we can also come off of mic at the audience Q&A portion and make sure we get all of your questions answered. And with that, this will be recorded and shared with all of you 48 hours following the session. And if you just have any tech difficulties, message me, but hopefully we won't have any of those today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Aaron to get us started.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. Can you all see the presentation? Is that screen sharing right now? Awesome.
Great.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for your time and to IPR and the Page Society for letting us do this case study and present this webinar to you. We are presenting Veritas v. Trump, which is a case examining the 2025 confrontation between Harvard University and the Trump administration. This case explores the tensions between institutional autonomy and federal authority and how those tensions shaped both business and communications responses. As Brittany said, I'm Aaron Taylor, and I'm joined by my teammates Yuri Sandoval and Ben Shorsman. And a quick note just for everybody about our presentation. The conflict between Harvard and the Trump administration is continuing to unfold this year, but our presentation and our case study are going to focus only on the actions that were taken during calendar year 2025, because that was our prompt for the case study. So why don't we dive in? First, it's important to understand the context that Harvard was operating in leading up to 2025. So Harvard is both the oldest and the wealthiest university in the United States. 8 US presidents have been Harvard alumni, and 8 Harvard alumni signed the Declaration of Independence. And yet in the past 3 years, Harvard stood at the center of multiple public relations crises. The Supreme Court struck down its race-conscious admissions policy. Harvard student groups earned national ire for signing a statement, quote, holding the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence immediately following the Hamas-backed attack on Israel. And former Harvard President Claudine Gay resigned after just over 100 days in office amid outrage over how she had handled the student groups and allegations of plagiarism. So by 2024, public trust in Harvard had really eroded. Harvard's net favorability rating fell 15 percentage points from 36 in June of 2023 down to 21. But perhaps surprisingly, even more pronounced was the drop among Republicans, which slipped from a positive 21 to a negative 6. This created a context in which Harvard entered 2025 with both strong institutional identity and increased reputational vulnerability.
Thanks, Erin. Building on that context, I would like to take a step back and look at the broader cultural landscape that shaped this conflict. Zooming out, a greater cultural conversation about the utility and purpose of higher education had been simmering for some time. Since the late 1960s, federal policy had expanded access to college and fueled a college for all model as vocational education steadily declined. By the early 2020s, Americans were losing confidence in higher education. For example, a Gallup poll from 2024 found that 37% of participants felt that universities were failing to prepare students with practical job skills. Political proposals from the Republican Party, like Agenda 47 and Project 2025, responded by recommending curtailing diversity, equity, and inclusion offices in universities, reshaping accreditation, and shifting federal funding to support workforce readiness programs. Conservative commentators pointed to Hillsdale College, a private liberal arts institution that accepts zero federal or state funding, relying instead on private donations, endowment growth, and large-scale public outreach, as proof that institutional independence from federal oversight was possible. The American Enterprise Institute argued that Harvard could, like Hillsdale College, refuse all federal funding and be completely free of federal regulations. While Reason magazine contended Harvard should emulate Hillsdale and cut ties with federal government if it truly wants autonomy. AP News reported that some policymakers questioned whether Harvard preferred billions in federal research support over full independence, noting other institutions have chosen the Hillsdale path and relinquished federal money to preserve control. Thank you. So that was the cultural and political context surrounding higher education. With that context in mind, let's look at how those broader debates translated into concrete actions against Harvard. Soon after the second Trump administration was sworn into office in January 2025, they began enacting some of those proposals put forth in Agenda 47 and Project 2025. And by March, the Trump administration began reviewing Harvard's federal funding, alleging discrimination and unsafe conditions for Jewish students and following the pro-Palestine campus protest. In April, Harvard publicly refused the administration's demands for governance changes and federal oversight. In response, the administration froze $2.2 billion in grants and suspended visa privileges for international students. Harvard sued on both fronts. Over the summer, U.S. District Court Judge Alison Burroughs restored funding and prevented the government from enforcing student entry ban. In the fall of 2025, the government was permanently barred from freezing, terminating, or withholding federal grants from Harvard. During this period, Harvard also released its fiscal year financial report and announced its first deficit of $113 million since COVID. Harvard responded to this conflict through three primary business actions: legal action, stewardship, and political strategy. In summary, Harvard filed lawsuits challenging the federal actions. They implemented cost control measures, including layoffs, hiring and salary freezes, and paused capital projects. Also, leadership agreed to longer-term structural cost adjustments while increasing their use of external lobbying firms, investing more than prior years.
Awesome. Thanks, Kiri. So now that we have some context, let's look at who the key stakeholders are and where we separated them into three categories for the sake of this case study: the internal group, affiliated, and then external. So internally, we had students who felt the dispute directly in classrooms, in financial aid uncertainty, and for international students in visa stability, whether or not they could even make it to America to attend school. Faculty and researchers viewed it through the lens of academic freedom and the security of multi-year research cycles, and that was all thrown up in the air as we saw. Staff and administrators absorbed the operational impacts through hiring freezes, budget reviews, and program delays. Senior leadership and the Board of Overseers framed the dispute as a governance and autonomy challenge, coordinating Harvard's legal and federal response. In the affiliated camp, this is kind of the ones that bridge that gap a little bit. The alumni split along ideological lines, which shaped donor conversations and messaging needs. Some major donors did pull funding while others decided to give more. Parents and prospective students tracked the conflict for signals about aid, safety, and stability. And admissions experts noted controversy usually shapes perceptions of people who want to go to a certain college. Individual schools, especially the Kennedy School, took local action. There were contingency plans for international students and new scholarships reinforcing mission commitment. And then externally, we had the Departments of Education, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services that drove the operational impacts through investigations, those funding freezes, and visa restrictions. The White House and Department of Justice framed the dispute around anti-Semitism, federal oversight, and compliance, and really on those ideological lines. And the judiciary ultimately determined the legality of those actions and reversed a lot of the freeze. Media coverage amplified each development and shaped public perception. More conservative media outlets amplified the administration's claims and talking points, while more neutral and liberal outlets countered the government's narrative and defended Harvard. Meanwhile, peer institutions watched very closely, treating the outcome as precedent. What happened at Columbia University offers a useful parallel case in some ways. And together, all these pressures shaped how Harvard responded, both operationally and strategically.
All right. The 2025 conflict placed Harvard Public Affairs and Communications, also known as HVAC, at the center of the university's response. Led by Vice President Paul Andrew, HVAC manages Harvard's relationship with government officials, media, local communities, and the broader public. During the conflict, HVAC coordinated messaging across formal letters, university-wide updates, school-level communications, and national media engagement. Harvard messaging focused on constitutional concerns, academic freedom, and the impact of federal actions on research and students. HVAC shifted strategy from outsourcing to a predominantly in-house model focused on message control and consistency. The team amplified Garber as Harvard's primary spokesperson, framing communications around mission, research impact, and operational continuity. Under this leadership, the communication approach evolved as the crisis progressed.
So you can see here on the screen, we're going to now get into the communication action across the crisis. It rolled out and we identified three phases. The first was the early phase from March to May of 2025, and that included that initial federal actions. Harvard responded to early federal inquiries with formal letters outlining constitutional concerns and clarifying requested information. The university publicly posted President Alan Garber's April 11th and 14th letters that refuted the administration's demands, ensuring transparency and letting stakeholders review the facts directly. And after the $2.2 billion in research funding were frozen, Harvard issued university-wide communications explaining the operational impacts and legal steps underway. That's both the internal and external comms action there. The escalation phase was the second one from June to August of 2025, when Harvard dealt with the funding freezes and visa restrictions actually coming into effect. Harvard shifted into more of a sustained multi-channel campaign, really designed to defend its autonomy, stabilize internal stakeholders, and frame the dispute as a threat to national research capacity and framing it away from a focus on them. The Boston Globe reported an all-out media blitz with Garber as the public face across the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, and major broadcast networks. International students' messaging also intensified after DHS visa restrictions went into place with expanded resources and advising support. And then in the final stage was the resolution and aftermath phase from September to November 2025, though it's still really unfolding to a degree, as Aaron said at the top. Also, I just want to call attention to these two, the Truth Social and the quote from Alan Garber in there is like really interesting dichotomies in this whole thing. So Harvard released a comparatively short public statement from President Garber in the fall. Internally, the university denied considering a settlement, according to a leaked statement from a faculty meeting. Focus appeared to shift more toward OBBA's endowment implications and welcoming students back to campus for the start of the 2025-2026 school year, signaling more of a return to business as usual. And even as Harvard tried to move on, it found itself really thrust back into the national spotlight through other ways. An example of how organizations now live in this world of polycrisis and really must be ready to deal with multiple comms issues stacked on top of each other. House Democrats in October released the unsealed Epstein files, revealing past communications between former President Larry Summers and Jeffrey Epstein. While not related to the federal administration's initial issues with the university, the Epstein files have been a persistent national issue, and Harvard's relation to them really kept the media and federal scrutiny on the school, which is still ongoing.
So reputation for Harvard isn't just about image, it's also Harvard's currency. Studies show that reputation drives enrollment, partnerships, and philanthropy, and in higher education, those truly sustain operations. We can assess reputation impacts across 4 indicators. First, we can look at the public opinion polling. A Morning Consult poll showed that while 49% of Americans had recently heard something about Harvard, Americans with no opinion about Harvard shrank by 8%. Those with favorable and unfavorable views of Harvard increased equally, plus 4% in each direction. The second indicator is applications. Applications were around 6,000 fewer in 2025, but this decline could also be attributed to the fact that Harvard once again started requiring SAT scores for the first time since the pandemic. Acceptance and yield rates remained consistent with previous years, which, as you can see, is the very small dark red bar at the bottom of the chart there. So despite that drop in applications, Harvard remains very selective with a large pool of applicants to draw from. Philanthropy is also another indicator. In 2025, current use gifts increased to the most ever received in the school's history, but endowment gifts fell for a third year in a row, indicating that the donors Harvard had lost in 2023 had not returned. And as you can see here, Harvard did retain top rankings during 2025, but their reputational pressure did quickly become a business problem for Harvard. Like I said before, their reputation isn't just an intangible asset, it is a major financial driver. In 2025, 46% of Harvard's $6.7 billion in revenue came from philanthropy. Because philanthropy depends on donor confidence, reputational crises can truly have a meaningful financial consequence for this institution. While we can't establish causation without access to Harvard's internal fundraising data, a few public indicators do suggest that donor behavior was influenced by the university's actions during this crisis. On the one hand, gifts to Harvard's endowment declined for the third consecutive year in a row. From 2023 to 2024 alone, endowment gifts fell by $192.5 million, and multiple sources linked this decline to donor dissatisfaction with Harvard's handling of campus protests related to the Israel-Gaza conflict. And there was reporting done by the student newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, that identified several major donors who publicly stated that they'd withdrawn their support from Harvard for that very reason. On the other hand, Harvard also experienced increased donor support when it took a more visible public stance. Following President Garber's April 2025 announcement that Harvard would challenge federal actions in court, the university received more than 4,000 small dollar donations, totaling about $1.14 million in just 48 hours. The mixed donor response here is reflected in Harvard's broader fundraising results for FY25. Although endowment giving declined, current use gifts increased by 19% or $101 million, reaching the highest level the university had ever achieved in current use fundraising. Because Harvard reports finances on a July to June fiscal year, the full fundraising impact of the 2025 crisis won't really be visible until the FY26 financial reports are released, which is this current fiscal year. However, there are already a few signs that I did look back into 2026 actions that we might be seeing increased donor engagement as a result of their actions. In February 2026, Harvard announced a $50 million matching gift initiative, the Research Accelerator Challenge, to permanently endow 50 PhD fellowships in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. This gift and the campaign came after Harvard's announcement in the fall of 2025 that the Faculty of Arts and Sciences would cut PhD admission rates in the sciences by half in response to uncertainties around continued federal funding. And in the gift announcement, Dean Hopi Hoekstra cited, quote, renewed philanthropic momentum as one factor allowing this college to expand graduate student support. So despite successful current use fundraising in FY25, Harvard still faced significant financial pressure throughout calendar year 2025. The university reported a $113 million operating deficit, its first since the pandemic, and they attributed part of that shortfall to the federal policy changes. Harvard estimated that the increase in the federal endowment tax to 8% would reduce annual resources by around $200 million a year, and withdrawn federal funding created an additional $58 million financial impact. To manage those pressures, Harvard implemented a series of cost containment measures that included layoffs, salary and hiring freezes, and deferring capital projects. Ultimately, Harvard's response to this crisis was not solely about finances or policy. It was protecting the university's symbolic power and their greatest asset, their reputation.
All right, let's bring this home and talk a little bit about the page principles as well. So, for us, this case really illustrates a complex interaction between institutional values, operational dependencies, and those external pressures that can force those in different ways. In assessing this case, we recognize there were gaps in organizational research, and there are just some things we just can't know without having worked for Harvard and been in the room for a lot of these discussions. But Harvard displayed values over vulnerability. It refused federal demands despite facing a 15% revenue exposure, which a lot of colleges around the country might have, succumbed to a little bit in a different ways. It maintained a message discipline across channels, internal, media, legal, school level communications all aligned. It also reframed the fight. It was more science versus political interference and not Harvard versus Trump, though we will admit, leaning into that for the title because it's pretty catchy. The framing of the issue emphasized broader societal impact, particularly in relation to research and public benefit and the role of higher education, especially in America, in that enterprise. Pulling back, the federal administration's attack on Harvard was the focal point of a much broader discussion around trust in higher education that Yuri mentioned higher up in the presentation. It was a lightning rod for perceived issues President Trump and some other conservatives have against universities. Meanwhile, Harvard became the focus for institutions across the country, and there were ripple effects for how other schools managed their own crises. Harvard's actions can be analyzed in relation to page principle number 2, which is prove it with action through alignment between messaging and operational decisions. They also reflect page principle number 5, which is conduct public relations as if the whole enterprise depends on it through coordinated organization-wide communication. Overall, the case highlights how organizations navigate tensions between mission, reputation, and external constraints in an extremely visible environment. So for us in closing, Veritas versus Trump leaves communications professionals with one takeaway. When your values are tested, your communication strategy is your values. And on one last thought, the reason cases like this really matter is that they give us, the rest of us, a clearer picture of what disciplined communication looks like when it's tested. Harvard made choices we can study, argue with, and learn from. And we're glad we got to do that work. And we're really looking forward to the questions part of this whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bravo. I see many. There's a deafening, thunderous applause here of virtual hand claps for you all, and it is well warranted. I just have to say, as one of the people who had the privilege of judging the case studies, there was exemplary work just across the board, and that means that there was real competition. And so Ben, Aaron, Yuri, and Professor Davis, I really tip my hat to you. This is really terrific work, and I think I speak for everybody on this line saying that that is, really a cut above. My first question for you, and by the way, we are going to open this up for questions from the whole audience in a little bit. My first question for you is just a little bit about the framing and the outcome. The way you frame this is that it's about, it's a war for Harvard's myth, which, pretty much everybody understands. It's the preeminent, educational institution, perhaps in the world, and not just about the money. And so I wonder how you think about whether or not that war was won, how you would qualify or quantify that. And some of that is in your presentation, but I'd love to hear you extemporaneously respond to that juxtaposition of the money versus the myth.
I could dive in here to kick us off. So I kind of think what I want to look to measure whether it won the war is the 4 indicators that the case identified. So the rankings, the public opinion, applications, and donations to kind of understand that. And particularly since most of the activity happened in Q4 of FY25, I'm really looking forward to seeing what the FY26 and even the FY27 impacts are across, applications, donations, rankings. I particularly think when we wonder about the myth of Harvard, if we see another Morning Consult poll, that'll be a fascinating comparator to see how they were performing before the conflict versus after the conflict. But at the end of the day, Harvard is still Harvard. They weathered the storm and they made it through. Their endowment allowed them to continue litigating, which I think gave them that autonomy and allowed them to remain true to themselves. But Ben and Yuri, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, we alluded to it a little bit, but obviously, I think they definitely were able to come out on the upper hand on this, or upper hand as well as you can when you're the focus. And they did lose a lot of money. But I think it through it as like, could a regional public research institution have done the same? Full disclosure, we're at the University of Oregon and thinking through, could the U of O handle this sort of spotlight and reputational pressure and financial pressures? And they don't have the endowment that Harvard does. Very few people, very few universities in the country do, and so that allowed them really to weather it in a way that I don't think many other institutions in the world could have.
Thanks for that. So one of the tensions that I've felt in just reading your materials is that there's kind of this dialectic between being reactive but also having message discipline. And they sometimes work exclusive to one another. Sometimes they can work hand in hand. And yet I'm wondering if you were to go back and say, if you were able to advise the team at Harvard, what might have been the earliest moment that they might have been able to do something to get kind of ahead and get out of that reactive mode? What might they have said or done differently?
Yeah, I'll start with this one and then let Aaron and Yuri jump in. Yeah, you usually think like the best time to communicate is before the crisis even begins, and like you, not to say that they needed to have a crystal ball and like anticipate where this was going, but there were definitely things that um, Harvard could have done. Really, looking back, the earliest moment wasn't in 2025 at all. It was back in 2023, 2024. Harvard contributed to its own crisis a little bit by mishandling the congressional testimony moment in how Claudine Gay resigned. And by the time that the President Garber wrote that letter in April of 2025, he was working with a depleted reservoir already of goodwill. And that was why I think a lot of the focus was already on Harvard, not just because it's this institution, but conservatives were able to really use it as that tent pole for focusing their ire around a lot of that handling of protests on campuses in 2023 and 2024. So proactively having done maybe a little bit more authentic cleanup around that, there was, like we said, a lot of things that were already heading toward a confrontation. Agenda 47 was published in 2023. All of the things leading up in that national election. So there was maybe some groundwork that they could have framed to maybe set themselves up a little bit better. But then it just kind of blew up, and then in any crisis, as you know, it just sort of from there, it takes on a life of its own.
Aaron or Yuri?
I was just, it occurred to me, as we were doing this study, that the April announcement, President Garber's letter saying that they were going to litigate and fight back against the Trump administration, that's an internal decision. So you're working with your legal team. So you have a little bit of
Mm.
runway there to decide what the comms are going to be in the plan as you go into that announcement. But then everything that followed is you are having to react to what the administration, you don't know what the administration is going to do next. And so that's where they got a little more reactive, I think.
Yeah. And quite in real time as well.
Yeah.
I was teaching at Columbia at this time, so some of these notes from your case study give me a little bit of PTSD. Um, so a question that's kind of near and dear to my heart as somebody who looks at employee experience and internal communications as sort of the niche that I'm most focused on in the communications profession. I wonder what you think about how I mean your case study documents like how much there was faculty anxiety, students concerned, leaked meeting statements. And so how would you gauge and sort of how did Harvard's internal communications measure up? And like what do you think that that pressure from within the organization drove the Harvard leadership team to do or say differently?
Since I handled the shareholders part of this, I'll also start this. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but internally, I feel like they did operate well at the macro level, right? They were out there, Garber's letters. They have their Harvard Gazette on their website where they really did a great job of posting a lot of things and keeping things current. And the convocation and morning prayer remarks were unified. Um, it was interesting that leaked faculty meeting statement in August, where the administration's reportedly denying settlements, talking with the New York Times while it was being reported on, is that's kind of a problem, but that's not really a comms failure. That's a trust failure surfacing through comms channels. Um, we see it, at the University of Oregon and across, any institution that has to do internal communications is like when your faculty learns about institutional strategy in the news, it's kind of signaling that they're second and not really a priority for you as a
Mm,
focal point of comms.
mm, mhm.
Um, and that erodes a little bit of that unified front. And so Harvard really did have to maintain those two messages of we're not going to surrender publicly and we are negotiating privately. But you also have to bring along everyone internally into that. And, I feel like there's always room to grow. I work a little bit in internal comms and like that's always feels like sometimes an afterthought in orgs, and being able to really champion that and bring them along with you. And so they feel valued is huge and could have really helped in some of these cases.
A man after my own heart there. Erin, Yuri.
I think one of the key things was paying attention to how external communications are internal communications and internal communications can
Yeah.
easily become external communications. So again, like Ben said, that message discipline between the two areas is super important. We got a little bit of a peek behind the curtain with just some of the reporting that was done on internal comms, but didn't have access to any of the full internal comms. So it's really a big open question for me. I would love to have seen more of how they were managing their internal comms, particularly message discipline with deans, with vice presidents, other folks who are still spokespeople for the university, making sure that they are on the same page with the president.
Yeah. Erin, I really love how you presented that in the actual presentation as well. Rather than some hard line of internal versus external, which is kind of magical thinking, as you just said, but rather as a spectrum, where
Mhm.
there are folks who are, deeply committed because they're part of the organization in a very formal way, people who are affiliated, like alumni and so on, and then folks who are like more clearly external, who may not have a stake in the outcome, like the media, for example. They're more interested in selling newspapers or what have you. Was there did that come from a certain model, or was that just your instinct to how you categorize those different stakeholders?
I
Ben
remember
and
the
I,
whiteboard.
yeah, I remember the whiteboard.
There was a whiteboard involved.
It was a
I'm going to
whiteboard.
guess that the whiteboard did not come pre-filled out. Say more.
Ben, do you remember? I'm harking back.
Yeah.
Ben and I, it was in that office, possibly Ben's office in Johnson Hall. We sat down, we were trying to figure out, I think we just listed as many stakeholders as we could think as bullet points, and then started looking for patterns and trying to understand, how do we categorize this? How do we interpret, what are the different needs of these stakeholder groups? What are the different channels that they're going to be
Mm,
reached through? Is there a hierarchy? And then categorize them that way.
Yeah. And then I think the real breakthrough is we found this middle group that we were trying to want to add in both internal and external stakeholders,
Mhm.
and like alumni, donor, like kind of this group that really aren't like when as an internal communicator, I'm not communicating them directly like faculty and staff, but they're a little bit closer in than just someone who's reading about Harvard on the news, right? And so that was, I think, the breakthrough moment for us, where that felt like a really key bucket. Parents
mm,
of students example is a really good example too of people who would be concerned about the reputation of institution. Um, because they might have a financial stake in it, or they're sending a loved one there who's going to spend the next 4 years of their lives there or something like that. So
right. The timing, I mean, just the reality of, the, President Summers being named in the Epstein files. is like such a wrench that comes out, and I mean, like, whoa, Deus ex machina, whatever you want to call it. What would you, I mean, just it's sort of almost like answering your own question, um, about how it's related to the page principles. What might Harvard have done differently, not just said differently, but have done differently, and on what timeline relative to exposing, a senior person in Harvard in the Epstein files?
I'll jump in here. I really think it does connect to page principle number 2, which is prove it with action. So, like, if public perception is determined 90% by what a organization does and 10% by what it says, then the most important thing in that crisis was what you would do. So they did actually act. They cut financial ties with Epstein in 2008, and Summers went on leave in November of 2025 and then resigned in February 2026, I want to say. So in that regard, I think it was less of a communications crisis and more of a like governance crisis that happened with a lack of action between 2008 and 2025. There were things that could have been done to
Mm.
better separate the ties between Harvard and Epstein at that time. But then when it came down, like when the information came out in 2025, I think they communicated as quickly as they could. And given that you have to act first.
One last question for me before I open up the floor, and I know Professor Ford and I already well, we have more than one Professor Ford here. Pat had a question, and then I know there's another one. Oh, there's some more coming up in the chat too. So I'm going to turn it over to that in just a moment. And I encourage others to either raise your hand using the little raise your hand button, or just drop a note in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll call upon you. But my last question for the team here is, I mean, you had mentioned, I mean, you talk about in the case study itself, you talk about, you're candid, like there are things that we could not access that would have made this, would have helped us draw some conclusions and so on. And you even just referenced it earlier about some of the internal comms and the internal discussion. If there was like one amazing source that you could have that would have made this case study so much more conclusive or could have clarified things for you, what might that be? I'd love to hear a little an answer from each one of you. If there was one document or interview or whatever, what would be your dream source to improve the case study?
We'll let you go first.
Thank you. So I feel like all the internal documents that we were able to find were really helpful to like get a real insight of what's going on. So I would say probably this is not the best resource, but for me, it was the Crimson magazine. I think that was a really helpful resource for me.
Aaron?
I will own as our resident fundraising nerd. I would love to get my hands on their CRM if it's like a Salesforce instance or something to better
I'm sure
understand.
you're not the only one who would like to have their hands on Harvard CRM, but yes, okay.
I would
Me
just like to
too.
see, yeah, exactly. Like more, is there real data that backs up that the how they handled things, their actions, the reputational implications had impacts on fundraising? Were there other things going on, like a big campaign that they were doing, a huge push, or
Mm,
something like that? Like I would love to see CRM data.
awesome.
So I'm going to
Ryan?
own my job. I actually work at the U of O in executive communications. I work closely with the Office of the President. And so I understand a little bit how the back end of these crises happen and just the chaos that can happen. And I would be absolutely fascinated to have an interview with Paul Andrew, or the
Mm,
chief of staff to the president, or someone who was privy to those conversations as they were happening. I know how many internal documents are passed back and forth and talking point documents. Usually, the chief marketing officer, the chief communications officer is putting together a messaging house in the lead up to these things or as things are unfolding and pulling out sentiment documents and um, being able to pick the brain of Mr. Andrew, I think would be really, really beneficial to understand like how they framed things, why they chose to lean in one place and maybe not even respond in another, because sometimes
Mm,
not responding is the better strategy.
yeah.
And it's always fascinating to hear when organizations choose to or not to respond. So that's probably who I would want to talk to.
Wow. That's great. Thank you for that. Mr. Pat Ford, you had your hand up. I'm sorry I made you linger there, but please, question.
Thank you, thank you, Ethan. And let me just say to this team, um, it was a really great case study. And I'm starting with the title. I love the title of this paper because that's really what it did come down to. And many of us have been involved in companies and organizations, institutions whose reputation is under assault for good or other reasons. Uh, and it becomes a real question about whether you look for the easy way out or try to sort out some way to avoid that. Uh, Ben, you talked about how powerful Harvard is because of the size of their of their corpus there, but in many ways that also makes it more tempting to
Yeah.
yield. You saw one of the biggest law firms in the country completely folded. And this was all happening in the midst, as Ethan was saying, of a lot of other things going on. And I was thinking of your case study, not only because I was going to be sitting in on this, but there was a interesting piece on how ABC right now, how Disney is handling some of the push from the FCC that CBS so tragically folded under for reasons we all know. But the courage, but also the commitment and that commitment to your stakeholders is so important. I remember back in the sort of early iconic crisis that J&J had with Tylenol, where the CEO made a crucial point, and he said it forcefully, that they felt that to do anything, even though they didn't poison that stuff, there was somebody was tampering with it and so on. They could have talked their way about how to doing a global recall and so on. And his point there was that would have been a betrayal of our credo, and that at that point the money becomes the cost of that becomes a secondary thing. And I thought you portrayed that well, starting with the title, but also in how you were showing that uh, by now, Aaron, you would know if there were drastic differences because in any organization, once time passes a little bit, what everybody was thinking at the time comes out. And a place like Harvard, believe me, we'd all know chapter and verse if there was a crucial thing there. And I think you accurately portrayed that internal struggle, which was indeed an external struggle as well. And so I just want mine was more of a comment than a question, was just to say that it was wonderful. I went in and read the case, and I thought you resisted that urge to fall into a temptation that sometimes happens with these, having been a faculty advisor on some of these, but also in earlier years as a judge. I've seen where you could see that student teams would fall a victim to taking the easy kind of portrayal of of course everybody was angry. Why wouldn't they be angry? Well, what we want to know is what's the evidence of that anger and where
Mm,
where is that coming from and what does it mean? And so for the level of critical thinking, the level of 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 if you will, setting aside your own personal biases or political inclinations or whatever else, and looking at it as analysts, like a scholar and a frontline journalist would, um, and having worked over the years with many scholars and many journalists who had very strong points of view. I'm sure Dr. Ford would agree with me on this. Um, the great ones set those aside somewhere. Of course they have a point of view, but if they're going to be a true scholar and if they're going to be a true journalist, they're going to look at it from an analytical point of view and not as where did this come out in the political spectrum? And I thought you handled that well, and I just thought this was a great choice. So congratulations and thank you for it.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Ben, Yuri, Aaron, you just take that in. You've just heard from one of our profession's legends, just absolutely slathering some praise on you there. So let that one in. And there's in the question, rather in the comments, there's a question that's kind of a build on Pat's comment there from Carly. And Carly Owens, I'll just read out what you wrote in here. I love the idea that when you're in a crisis, your communication strategy are your values. She asked, how do you ensure that your leadership buys into that?
Hmm.
Do you want to take some?
That's a great question. I think you need a comms team that is one, you need a leadership that is willing to listen to your communications team, and not just as someone that's like an afterthought, like, oh, we need to say something to the masses, now we need to bring in marketing or communications to say something. Someone who's actually part of the discussion in those early days. um, worked at organizations where it has been one way, and I work at one where it's the other, where we feel like we're a part of it, where we could actually voice a concern or push back when we feel like we're drifting um, from those values. But it really does come from leadership, and that was one thing I had written down as Professor Ford was talking, was about you have to give credit to leadership in this too, around um, being able to maintain that and like have that vision. Because you're right, it was a very courageous decision to make the choice to stand up against the federal administration, and not something that many institutions across the country would be able to do or make the choice to. And so, yeah, you really have to have a group that is like knows what that North Star is for your institution and is constantly looking back at it and like reaffirming it, and having people who can kind of keep the guide rails on when you feel like when you're kind of veering off course.
Aaron and Yuri, I see you nodding your heads. Yes to that.
Yes. I
Okay. Yeah,
I
go
lean
ahead.
towards centering the stakeholders as well. I think if the question is about like how do you convince leadership teams to lead with
Yeah.
values, centering it around what the impact is going to be to your stakeholders and how important it is that your values-based
Smart.
communication lands internally, externally in that middle ground that we identified. And I think that ties into some of the page principles as well of your people are your biggest advocates. I'm paraphrasing what the principle is there, but your people are the ones who represent the organization best. So paying attention internally matters.
That's fabulous. Dr. Rochelle Ford, a former university president, is noting that university cultures are quite diverse. Dr. Ford, would you like to voice over your question for the students?
Yeah, thank you, Ethan, for moderating this. And congratulations. You guys did an absolute, I got to see your presentation live, so it's nice to see it again. So thank you for being here and sharing. And I think to your note, could you talk to the chief comms officer? He has lived through 5 Harvard presidents, which is remarkable, because that usually Harvard is not a revolving door. When it comes to university presidents, but I think a lot of university presidents are revolving doors now. And part of it is that the stakeholders that universities have to deal with just on the internal front, it is one of the few organizations in the world that is built for freedom of speech, of expression of ideas, of exchange, and encouraged. And the joke often is that working in university administration is herding cats. Like you're supposed to build a university culture which is built to deconstruct every idea that comes out, and challenge what truth is. And so when analyzing the case, how did you take that into consideration? And then also knowing this, and I guess, Ben, you work in university comms at the executive communications level. How does this affect Aaron, your Yuri, and then your thought about would it be interesting to continue to work in university communications because the life of a university administrator, of a staff person is so completely different than that of a faculty, of a student, and the other stakeholders that are engaged in a university environment.
And there's a lot there. I immediately was thinking about how sometimes, so I write remarks for the president of the University of Oregon, and the way he likes to talk about this sometimes is the whiplash between when he's speaking to external audiences who are almost always really excited about what the U of O is doing. When you're talking to these donors and alumni and other people, business people, like they're just so stoked on things and just like so happy. And he's able to be that rah rah, here's the awesome stuff we're doing for the community and all the things. And then the next day he'll be in a meeting or speaking to an internal audience who is just so upset at all the choices that are being made. And yeah, the questioning of the truth thing really comes and plays a center role there around academic freedom. I'm sure Professor, I'm sure Donna could also speak to this too, having like working on the J School faculty, but like, um, yeah, the internal communications is really crucial in that, and is trying to build those coalitions. And it's fascinating work. I actually find that like I enjoy the work a lot because of that. It's a challenge, and it provides a daily chance to kind of reaffirm values and just kind of do the work and really build those coalitions and speak to and listen to people where they're at. Really, I mean, you have to understand that where faculty is coming from is much different than administration or anyone else. So, Aaron, Yuri?
Yeah, I will also own that I do also work for the University of Oregon in university advancement, hence the fundraising nerd. I'm helping to launch the next comprehensive fundraising campaign for the university. But kind of a shout out to Donna is that this case study and this master's program has had a tremendous impact on my career growth just in the last year. I have seen just so much expansion of my knowledge and what I'm able to bring to the table in my work as a result of going through this grad program. And particularly the topic that we study, like a lot of what we were learning from this case study was applicable back at our work lives. And then I want to give a shout out to Yuri and just call back to what Pat was saying earlier, which is Yuri brought for Ben and I kind of an outside perspective that really got us out of our heads in a lot of our team discussions and made us question and challenge some of our insider assumptions and thinking. So I think a lot of that balance that you see in the case really is driven by the fact that we had Yuri on our team and she got us into more creative external thinking than we would have been if it was just Ben and I on the case.
Certainly.
Mhm.
Amazing. Other questions from the audience or comments?
I have more of
Oh,
a
Amber, yeah.
comment just because I literally took a class with Pat last semester where we did sort of a case study thing with strategic comms and it just had like flashbacks. And I thought you guys did really great, especially with your analytical perspectives, because I'm a data geek and I love that you had, even though you didn't have like the CRM and everything, still really perspective stuff and really good estimates, like researched and yeah, good estimates of what could have affected.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great call out. That reputation is currency. Forgive me if I didn't get that precisely, but that sure the title of that slide is clever and correct, and but the presentation of the financial impact I thought was really done precisely and well as well. Really, really strong. Professor Davis, may I put you on the spot for just a moment to give you the floor to just share your experience and maybe offer an insight about what you see in this case study?
Certainly. I think a couple of things. I mean, obviously, I'm so insanely proud of these students. And I am the work that they did in this, I harp on them, and so I was really, really grateful to hear Professor Ford's feedback, because I would say, don't say what you think, say what you know, and have the evidence to
Mm.
back it up, always. And remember your bias. And we focus on that and reinforce that over and over and over again, so that it's think about where you're coming from on this and then get rid of that and put yourself in the shoes of all of your audiences. And I had several groups that wrote these case studies on a multitude of organizations, and it was very thrilling to see how they embraced that feedback and ran with it. And when I read the case for the first time, I looked at them and I said, "This is a winning case study." I was blown away myself when I read their work, and how thorough it was. And it was something I didn't realize until just recently is Aaron also had said that we teach a class in finance for strategic communication, where they learn the language of finance, and that the content that they were getting in that course helped them look at it in a way that really strengthened their understanding and reporting on the role of the financial effects and impacts of the case. So all three of them, the other amazing thing I want to say about them is all three of them really contributed in very meaningful and different ways. And at the same time as they did, you could just see it come together in a way that, to use the term, dream team, they were. And it's always thrilling to teach a team like this.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Professor Davis. And my team and I have been doing some research, and in fact, with the IPR's Organizational Communications Research Commission, just rolls right off the tongue. We've been working on an economic model that links some, employee experience dimensions to financial outcomes. And at the end of the day, we all want to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And also, as strategic communicators, we need to make the case to people who may have differing values to us and who may not think that the right thing is the right thing. And when we can make that data-driven economic argument, our hand is all the stronger. And so congratulations again to you, Professor Davis, Aaron, Yuri, Ben. Such a pleasure. This is a real feather in your cap. I'm really, really, I'm just very happy for you that you got a chance to share your great work with this group. I want to hand it over to Brittany before we close out. And thank you to the Institute for Public Relations and to Paige for putting this whole thing together. Brittany.
Thank you. All right. And thank you, Ethan, for moderating that fantastic Q&A. Again, just echoing congratulations, everyone, on a fantastic case study. This will be recorded. I mean, this is recorded and it will be emailed to you within 48 hours. It'll be on our website and YouTube channel as well. So definitely check that out or share with any colleagues if that may be of interest. And with that, I will send you off and have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Thanks for joining.